Babidi bang, babidi bang, babidi bang.
It's May 1974. Genesis have just played the last show of their Selling England tour in New York's Academy of Music. This venue is just 20 minutes walk away from the Elgin Theatre. This was a cinema that was known for its late night avant-garde movie screenings. One such film that was shown there was El-Topo by filmmaker Alejandro Jodorowsky. It's highly probable, therefore, that this is where Peter Gabriel first watched the film El-Topo. It had a big effect on him. After watching it, with the movie palace now undone, Gabriel would probably have walked back through the neon-lit streets of New York back to his hotel. With El-Topo's surrealist images moving in the sidewalk's theme, it's easy to see how the Lamb came together in Peter's mind at that time. El-Topo is a bizarre western, typical of art house movies from this period. It has a rambling, nonsensical narrative, highly overt sexual imagery, and an almost improvised feel about it. I've saved you the misfortune of having to sift through this nonsense, and highlight here the similarities between it and what became the Lamb. Strap yourselves in, folks, this is a weird film. We have a flute-playing maverick, people who find themselves stuck in a cage. There's a grand parade. We have stalactites, they're the rock formations that hang down from the roof of a cave, and stalagmites, they're the rock formations that come up from the ground, and then, but you get the idea. There's a lily-white Lilith type character who leads someone past a group of crawling people onto a tunnel of light where the chamber's said to be. Rail cools off with the lamia of the pool. As they nibble the fruit of his flesh, he feels it, yet you really are watching this. Someone dies in a rapids, and there's even a raven. And to top it all, you've guessed it, Dr. Diaper appears to whip off someone's windscreen wiper. There's even a lamb in it. Bearing in mind that in May 1974, Peter Gabriel's wife was back in England and 7 months pregnant, it doesn't take Sigmund Freud to work out what was probably going on in this 24-year-old songwriter's mind at that time. I had to get it out of me, if you know what I mean. Yes, Peter, we get the drift. By contrast, the Lamb's origins also owe a debt to the classic novel Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. This is a classic Christian allegory of self-discovery. The story takes place as a narrator's dream, similar to what Gabriel would tell in the mid-concert interval stories. Unlike El-Topo, it's full of the concepts of temptation and guilt and strange otherworldly creatures. It could have been a lot different if Banks and Rutherford had their way. Their suggestion for a concept was the 1943 novel The Little Prince, a coming-of-age tale that has a character on a similar philosophical journey. Had this been chosen, the Lamb would have probably had a more pastoral feel to it. It's thought that the Banks song Madman Moon was based on the Little Prince novel, and perhaps this style of sound, which was similar to Selling England, may have been what the band had stayed with at that time. Peter's story, however, was to be set on the mean streets of New York. Its central character, a Latin American street kid. Gabriel has often noted that he wanted a much grittier tone to this next album. It was a move that was starting to be made by musicians that would have been known to Peter at that time, with Peter Hamill, Brian Eno, and later Robert Fripp all starting to sense a musical change in the air. The story aspects of the album and Gabriel's insistence on writing all of the lyrics are still a bone of contention with the rest of the band, with Banks in particular astutely commenting that the narrative thread robs many of the tracks of existing in isolation. He does have a genuine grievance, for although the Lambs' lyrics contain some of the most vivid images in the band's catalogue, they ultimately hinder and dominate the album somewhat. Perhaps the most telling indictment of the Lambs concept is that Collins himself has admitted that he's never been bothered to read the story that's printed on the album's inner sleeve. And so, in June 1974, with half a story for an album, the band headed off to the affluent and leafy country village of Headley in Hampshire, the perfect setting to write a gritty urban street opera. Headley Grange was an old stately home that had fell into disrepair during the 1960s and had been rented out first to students before it was then turned into a rehearsal studio, supposedly by a young Richard Branson. This rat-infested squalor had been used and abused by the likes of Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac and Bad Company, prior to the upper middle class public schoolboys arriving. The time there was largely spent with the band in one room laying down the instrumental tracks and Gabriel in a separate room writing the lyrics. The tensions between Gabriel and the rest of the band were further exasperated when Gabriel's first daughter was born in July. To this end, he would spend a lot of time travelling back and forth from the band in Hampshire to see his wife in London. Communication with people beyond Headley Grange was difficult as it didn't have a telephone installed, and Gabriel has later recalled the journeys that he would take, armed with a pocket of coins, to the local village phone box. This phone box still stands there today, and it's strange to think that back in July 1974, Peter Gabriel would have stood in this phone box and dialed California to talk to the noted film director William Friedkin about a potential script collaboration. Hot off the success of The Exorcist, Friedkin was searching for new talent to work with. His attention was drawn to Gabriel after reading a short story on the back of the Genesis Live album. Gabriel temporarily left his bandmates for a few weeks to brainstorm ideas with Friedkin. That script idea was probably to have been for a film called The Devil's Triangle, a script idea that Friedkin was working on at that time. Friedkin's plan was to create a production team with Gabriel, the band Tangerine Dream and graphic artist Philippe Drouillet, but it failed to materialise. In an interview for the Sounds paper around this time, Gabriel openly makes reference to wanting to work with different artists, and this had all whet his appetite for a possible future beyond Genesis. Soon after this, Gabriel returned to his bandmates to start the actual recording of the album. Some 6 hours worth of rehearsal recordings somehow found their way out of Headley Grange and into the hands of collectors. These tapes can now easily be found on YouTube, and careful listening to them reveals some intriguing insights into how the final album could have been sequenced. Let's look at the final track listing that we know and love today. Firstly, we're going to remove the tracks that were not recorded at Headley Grange. These were tracks that were put together whilst the Lamb was actually being recorded a few months later. Those tracks are Cuckoo Cocoon, Grand Parade, Carpet Crawlers, Anyway, Silent Sorrow, Ravine and Riding the Screen. They were all late additions to the album setlist and drafted in to plug gaps in the story. Next up for the Cull is Lily White Lilith. Now the basis for this track stems from a song called The Light that the band actually played live back in the Nursery Crime tours. Perhaps the first track that Phil Collins ever wrote for the band. The piece of music you're going to hear next is a small riff from Lily White Lilith, sandwiched into In the Cage. If this was Lily White Lilith's original use, then it's doubtful that the band would have developed the riff into a fully fledged song. Therefore, this track also goes from our listing. The next track to either be removed or moved is the Lamia. Now originally this was either part of or segued into Chamber of 32 Doors. Let's take a listen to this. Now remember that these are the original unedited Headley Grange demos. This is how the band would imagine these songs would glue together at certain points in time. It appears that the band didn't quite know how to end side one, as the Chamber of 32 Doors is also merged in with Counting Out Time in another take. I'm proposing that if it was used, the Lamia would have been a better closing to side one of the album than perhaps Counting Out Time, which would have been a better opener to side two. Certainly the screams and voices at the end of Counting Out Time will have merged well into the waiting room. Looking at this revised track listing, its immediate issue is that it's too long for a single album. We therefore had to imagine that many of these tracks would have been shorter than what they originally ended up on the final album. So what you're going to hear next is an example of this. So now that we've got In the Cage and Back in NYC next to each other on the same side, they can naturally glue together more seamlessly, and it seems to be that this was the original intention for these two tracks. Another example of songs being cut together differently was the part in The Fly in the Windshield, which goes something solid forming in the air. This doesn't appear to have been part of the original design, as the on-Broadway coda to the Lamb track blends directly into the part where the fly hits the windshield, as it were. All of this suggests a much tighter and faster paced album than what originally turned out, with songs being blended together more in the manner of a medley, something that the band would enjoy doing more in the future. It's hard to say if this more concise incarnation would have been any better, because I feel it's the sense of space and distance on the album that makes it work, with the strange ambient pieces that join the songs together being almost important as the songs themselves. In August, the band left Headley Grange and travelled to a similar old stately home in the Welsh countryside. Like Headley Grange, Glaspant Manor was regularly used by other musicians such as Black Sabbath and Queen. It's thought that the band recorded there for 2 months, using the Island Records mobile recording studio. It's unclear as to what was actually achieved in Wales, as the band ultimately ended up moving back to a more traditional setting of the Island Studios in Basing Street, London. By now this was September 1974, and Gabriel was still working on new lyrics for the album. Also in the Island Studios at this time was Brian Eno, recording his Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy album. Gabriel approached Eno and asked him to help with production effects on the Lamb album. In return, Collins would play drums for Eno. Tony Banks has dismissed the influence of Eno's involvement in the final mix, but I'm inclined to disagree. There's a fundamentally different tone and feel to the Lamb than anything before or after him, and I'm of the opinion that Eno's ideas and technical expertise probably had quite a lot to do with the final sonic qualities of the Lamb record.
It's an extortionate prices.
With the UK tour only weeks away, the band started hurried around-the-clock mixing sessions to complete the album. Matters were further complicated when Steve Hackett suffered an injury to his hand. This caused a postponement of those initial UK dates. It's also at this 11th hour that Gabriel finally discovered that the name of the central character, Rail, had also been used by The Who on their Sellout album, something that he'd been completely unaware of up to this point. It's during these final mixing stages that Gabriel actually suggested issuing the Lamb as 2 single records, Part 1 and Part 2, issued 6 months apart. This admission may account for the somewhat lack of parity between the 2 halves of the album. Sides 3 and 4 are notably weaker than sides 1 and 2. It's sides 3 and 4 that also have more of the ambient padding, although these segments may have been added later to account for costume changes within the live show. Furthermore, sides 3 and 4 contain more of the older recycled songs, with both Lily White Lilith, Anyway, and parts of Slipperman being written some 4 to 5 years previously. You could argue also that It has something of a rushed, anticlimactic feel to it. On the eve of the album's release, the track Counting Out Time was released as a single, but it failed to chart and received largely negative reviews. In late November, the album was finally released. The band by now were on tour in America, playing the whole album to an audience that had yet to buy it in the shops. Let's now examine these live shows and see how the Lamb came to life. The live show opens with slides of early morning Manhattan. The actual projectors seldom worked as planned, but either way, this tour probably represents the most ambitious theatrical show attempted in rock up to this point, arguably eclipsing what even Pink Floyd were doing at the time. Sadly, the show was never fully filmed professionally. What exists from over 100 shows is about 30 minutes of mostly poor quality audience cine film that's been bounced onto video and then into the hands of collectors. We'll look at about 5 to 10 minutes here, and trust me, these are probably the best 5 to 10 minutes. There are numerous editions of this Lamb footage in circulation on YouTube, but credit here has to be given to, I believe, a person called Chris West, who I understand is the main person responsible for painstakingly syncing up the original silent footage to an actual soundtrack, something that is believed to have taken months to do. The only pro-shot footage of the show was actually excerpts from a German documentary about a music promoter and nothing to do with the band themselves. This film team shot a few seconds worth of In the Cage, Slipper Man and Musical Box, thus proving they were at the whole concert. Now, I can't believe that a film crew would go to that time and effort and view a spectacle like this only to film a few minutes worth of footage, and I'm of the firm belief that the whole show must have been filmed that night. Now, whether or not this is still owned by someone and will ever be released is, of course, the holy grail for Genesis fans. With him telling stories in between acts, Gabriel is by far the standout element of this show, and he commands the stage fully. He hides on the floor playing his flute in Cuckoo Cocoon, he acts out the Grand Parade drones, and even explodes a petrol bomb in the back on NYC. As opposed to on the actual album, it's the latter half of the show which feels much stronger than the first. And in particular, the waiting room is something that far exceeds the studio version. This track was sometimes extended up to 9 minutes and is a loud and terrifying freeform nightmare with lots of tape effects going on. The sequence shown here is actually footage from the tribute band The Musical Box. As there really is only a few seconds worth of original footage existing, they managed to recreate the Lamb show with astonishing accuracy and with full support of Gabriel and the band themselves. Aside from Gabriel, obviously, it's Collins who I feel is the standout figure on these nights, using his largest and most wide-ranging drum kit ever. It's just phenomenal playing. And Collins is the one who is also the most critical of the costumes that were used in the shows. He astutely states that the Slipperman costume was really where Spinal Tap got their ideas from. One can almost sense Hackett and Rutherford's sheer embarrassment at what's going on, and Banks' probable rage as the Slipperman emerges from what is basically a huge inflatable cock. The fans, however, loved it, and although the tour left the band with massive debts, one feels that for every person who saw it, they must have gone home and told 10 others, because as a result, the Trick of the Tail tour and album sales were far more profitable. The shows certainly got the band noticed, and we should be really thankful for what is really just a handful of individuals who took along a cine camera on a few nights and gave us something to remember. The tour left a vivid image in the minds of all who saw it, and during 1979, ideas for a Lamb film were developed. Gabriel wrote a rough movie script with none other than the El-Topo director, Jodorowsky, according to Gabriel, the only man who could make this movie. Gabriel has also referenced jogging up Salisbury Hill to get fit to play the part of Rail in the movie. The idea, however, never really made it past the initial script stages, and considering how many bad album-to-movie adaptations there were in this era, it's probably not a bad thing. Overall, The Lamb is an album that slightly divides fans. For some, it is their best album, but then many Genesis albums can stake a claim to that. Some, however, see it as slightly overblown and difficult to listen to in its entirety. I wouldn't say it's their best, but I would say that it contains their best moments. Some of the individual musical elements of this, and certainly the lyrics, are certainly, I think, the best that this band ever did. It's got to be some of the most evocative and memorable music from this whole era. I could have made a whole other hour of this video discussing each of the songs in depth, such as their literary, mythological and psychological reference points. And I'm also conscious of not devoting enough time to discussing the album cover, which has got to be one of Hypnosis's best covers. These videos sort of take on a life of their own, and I'm surprised in making this how much overall focus and certainly images centred around Gabriel himself. If you discount the actual lyric writing, his overall input into the music is not that great, and Hackett's is almost non-existent. I still somehow consider this to be Gabriel's album. To my ears, the band that made The Lamb is almost like a completely different band to what made Selling England and Trick of the Tail. It's kind of the missing link in the Genesis chronology. But if I could write the history of the band any other way, I wouldn't. So there you have it, the story of Rail, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway.